Today is Monday. It's September the 13th. The title of today's devotional is Be a Prayer Warrior for Your Nation. And the title, or the scripture reading rather, is Psalm 20. Now, Psalm 20 is a brief song in the Psalms, and it has been described, though, as a national anthem for Israel. But surely it should be the prayer of all who call upon the Lord. It is an intercessory prayer, an exhortation to pray and call to the Lord. And I quote chapter 20 and verse 1 of Psalms, call to the Lord in the day of trouble. Now, I suggest it is also an exhortation for believers to intercede with God for their nation and leaders. I'm going to read the verses in this devotional as well as give the summary of the different parts of it. Psalm 20, verse 1 and 2. The Lord, that is eternal God Jehovah, the Lord hear thee in the day of trouble. The name or the renown of the God, Elohim, the mighty God of Jacob, defend thee. Send thee help from the sanctuary, from the tabernacle, from the place of worship, and strengthen thee out of Zion. The setting and the events that inspired this psalm are not stated, but because its author was David, I believe it was the king appealing to his people to call upon the Lord. Israel was perhaps facing an enemy, and the king dare not go to war without the confidence that the Lord would go before him. In Psalm 20 and verse 3 and 4 we read, remember all thy offerings and accept thy burnt sacrifice, Selah. That is, pause and think about that. Grant thee this prayer, this petition to the Lord. Grant thee according to thine own heart, and fulfill all thy counsel. Israel was confident the battle was the Lord's, and the people worshipped him. And they prayed he would accept their sacrifices, hear and answer their prayers. In Psalm 20 and verse 5, we read, we, Israel, all of God's people and the king, we will rejoice in thy salvation, in your deliverance in the battle. And in the name of our God, we will set up our banners, our flags, our standards. The Lord fulfill all thy petitions, all thy desires. Even before the battle was fought, the people believed the Lord would give their king the victory, and they promised to shout to the Lord for joy, and that he alone would be the object of their praise. They were ready to unfurl their battle banners, the flags carried into battle that identify national pride. And they believed the Lord would hear their prayers and answer their petitions. Psalm 20 and verse 6, another verse of this psalm. Now know I that the Lord saveth his anointed. Now, I believe these are the words of David, perhaps the words of the people for David, David being the Lord's anointed to be the king of Israel. And so we read in verse 6 again, now I know that the Lord saveth his anointed. He, the Lord, will hear him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. For most of us, we are right-handed. The right hand is then typically the stronger hand. It's the one most used. David's faith inspired him to face the enemy. Confident the Lord had heard the prayers of his people and would save them. His anointed. God was mighty, and with his right hand, from a human perspective, the strongest hand, God would save David in the battle. The psalmist goes on to read in verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we, Israel, we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Men and nations, you see, go into battle with little thought to the power of prayer or the providence of God. Their faith is in their strategy and their weapons of war. In David's day, chariots and horses. In our day, planes and tanks and artillery. David, however, urged the people to remember the name of the Lord our God. You know, we have observed in earlier devotions that the name of the Lord embodies all of his divine attributes. You see, the Lord is holy, just, powerful, omniscient, compassionate, sovereign. His name represents all that he is. And because he is sovereign, he will do as it pleases him. Now, the last two verses of this psalm, Psalm 20, verse 8 and 9. They, the enemies of God's people, the enemies are brought down, they're defeated, they are fallen. But Israel says, we are risen, and we stand upright, confident of victory. Now verse 9, save, Lord, Jehovah save. Let the King hear us when we call. Here's some closing thoughts, and really I would suggest three lessons we take from Psalm 20. The first is this, that the Lord hears and answers prayer. Israel prayed the Lord would hear the prayer of the king and his people and go before them into battle. And I would suggest to you all that we had leaders in this world who would call upon the Lord and humble themselves and not put their faith in weapons of war or generals or the Pentagon, but remember that the God of heaven hears and answers prayer. And so the second lesson is that we should pray and assure our leaders of our prayers. Israel assured the king they would pray for the Lord to grant him wisdom and bless his strategy for the battle. And I would suggest to you, blessed is the nation whose leaders call on the Lord and whose people uphold them in prayer. And the third lesson, God's people should put their faith in the grace and blessing of God. Even before the battle was waged, the people planned to celebrate the victory. They were confident God had heard and would answer their prayers. I want to close with one of my favorite stories of the American Revolution. The story is conveyed by a farmer during that great war of independence who was walking through the woods towards the encampment at Valley Forge, the winter encampment of the American soldiers. As he walked through the woods, he suddenly heard a voice. And drawing near, he found none other than the General George Washington himself on his knees, his cheeks wet with tears, praying to God. That farmer was said to have returned home and assured his wife that the United States would win her independence from England. And the farmer's wife asked, how can you be so sure? And he answered, because I heard Washington's prayer. Well, we read in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, this exhortation from Paul to Timothy in the church in Ephesus. I exhort, therefore, that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. How much we need in this world and in this day, leaders who pray and citizens who pray for them. God bless, and bye-bye.